Julian Sedgwick is an award-winning British writer of novels for teenagers. His critically acclaimed work has been widely translated, and much of his writing has Japanese themes. His best-known book, Tsunami reflects his travels in the northeast region of Japan, in the Fukushima prefecture, which he has visited many times since the Great East Japan earthquake of 2011. Direct Talk met author Julian Sedgwick at his home near Cambridge to hear about his deep connection with Japan and his interest as both a writer and therapist in introducing stories of hope and resilience to a UK and European audience.
I hadn't actually been to Fukushima before the disaster, but very close family friends have been living for 30 years in Fukushima City. And I was always interested in their stories of how different the Northeast was, Tohoku was, to the rest of Japan. And then after the disaster, we were getting emails daily about the aftershocks, because aftershocks were coming thick and fast, and about the radiation situation. And at the same time, I was reading about the evacuation zone that had been created around the Fukushima power station, Fukushima Daiichi. And an idea was forming in my head of a story I wanted to write about it. But the problem for me is I'm obviously not Japanese. I don't come from Fukushima prefecture, and I knew I had to go there and interview people and spend time there.
The 2011 Great East Japan earthquake was the most powerful in the country's history. Nearly 20,000 lives were lost in the tsunami that followed. Across the Tohoku region, survivors faced the challenge of not only rebuilding their homes, but also reclaiming their lives in the years after.
People were just genuinely wanting to tell me their story. Already, they were worrying their stories were being forgotten as the rest of Japan moved on. And the thought that someone might write about their stories and then take those stories back to the United Kingdom, to Europe, really excited people. There are so many stories that grabbed me, so many people whose experience I found so moving and inspirational. One in particular was Akiko Iwasaki, who was running a hotel on the coastline and was caught by the tsunami wave and washed under the water. She was trapped under wreckage. She thought she was dying. She was underwater for about 90 seconds. And she saw a bright light above her and she thought maybe that's heaven, and she struggled towards it, and it turned out to be the hillside, and she was pulled onto the hillside and rescued. And Akiko and her team and the community around her rebuilt their community. She rebuilt her hotel. And every day, she in the hotel to this day tells the story of being in the tsunami, of being rescued, and the rebuilding of her community and her love for the community.
Tsunami Girl, published in 2021, is set in a fictionalized version of Odaka in Minamisoma City, an area hugely impacted by radiation contamination from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant.
So I've always wanted to write a story about an abandoned space, because abandoned spaces create stories. And I decided to focus on the little town called Odaka. And I went to stay there just to meet people, to interview them. And from the start, I felt at home there. It's a town where, when I first visited, there was only about 20% of the population returned, if that. So it was very empty and very quiet. It was a surreal experience to be in the evacuation zone for the first time and to see your Geiger counter clicking up and see there really is radiation around you. But it was just the silence, the absolute silence and the emptiness, none of the normal buzz of everyday life, no radio, TV, no cars, no machinery, just birdsong, your footsteps, and empty houses, abandoned houses. And it was a deeply profound experience. I could already feel it working on my imagination. So I was walking along on my own on an abandoned street, and I could hear footsteps right behind me suddenly. And I thought, well, that's weird, because there can't be anyone behind me. And I looked round and there was no one there. I realised it was just my own footsteps echoing back off the metal shutters of the shop next to me, but you can see what was happening. My imagination was starting to create stories in the emptiness.
Tsunami Girl tells the story of a 15-year-old schoolgirl who is a quarter Japanese and who is anxious and struggling to fit in at school. To help younger readers connect with the story, Julian collaborated with a Japanese manga artist, Chie Kutsawada. On a trip to stay with her grandfather in Japan, Yuki Jones is caught up in the earthquake and tsunami, and her beloved grandfather is lost. With the help of a new friend, she finds courage and resilience to cope with tragedy.
So Yuki, who's the central character of Tsunami Girl, is an outsider. And I always identify with outsider characters. So the idea of Yuki took form very quickly. I knew she was going to be an outsider and knew she was going to be struggling in life. And then she was going to face this unbelievable problem. So a triple disaster, the earthquake, the tsunami, and the radiation evacuation. And I was just interested to see how a troubled outsider would respond to that. So as well as being a writer, I'm a therapist, and I work a lot with anxiety and panic. On my school visits, I meet a lot of troubled children who are struggling with anxiety and panic attacks, but I was also that anxious child. I was going through a very difficult school experience, and quite quickly I had people coming up to me after the book was published, saying the book had helped them. A girl came up to me who said her grandmother had died earlier that year and that reading the book had helped her, and that's better than winning any prize.
Julian's fascination with all things Japanese dates back to his childhood. He grew up in an isolated village in the countryside in southeast England. He enjoyed a very close relationship with his brother Marcus, who also became a writer. At university, Julian studied philosophy and East Asian studies, and after graduation he worked as a bookseller and screenwriter and trained as a therapist before turning to write books for teenagers.
So I think I was 12 years old when I picked up this book called World of Zen, just a lovely anthology full of little stories and pictures. And I probably hid it behind a comic at school so I didn't get bullied. And as soon as I opened the pages and saw the pictures of monks meditating or Japanese rock gardens, something rang a bell deep inside me. I can still remember the feeling of, this makes sense. This is something I understand. And then as I started to explore the language of Zen and the stories of Zen, I just felt I had a key to make sense of a world that I was struggling with to a degree. And from that point, that's been a guiding light in my life, really.
As a young man, Julian started making regular trips around Japan, alone and with his family. And at the end of 2024, Julian returned to the northeast coast of Japan. Rather than drive, he wanted to walk the route, doing around 30 kilometers daily and stopping to talk and collect stories from survivors and locals. He wanted to see for himself how people were coping and moving forward in their lives after such loss.
I think it's still something of a mystery why some people can find resilience and hope and some people get stuck in their trauma. As a writer and a therapist, I think it's about our own personal storytelling. Sometimes people get trapped in a negative loop of storytelling. Some people can break out of it and tell a positive story and find new meaning in their life. As to why that happens, I'm still not sure. That's why I keep wanting to interview people. One thing that does come up time and time again is after the disaster, people who could make new connections seem to do really well. So it's something about coming out from the self and finding new ways to connect to the world. It seems to work. But it's a complicated story, and if we had a neat solution to it, it would be easy to restore a lot of people's well-being.
While he was on his walk in 2024, Julian knew that he wanted to visit the empty phone booth, Phone of the Wind. It is an unconnected phone booth built in 2011 in Otsuchi by 78-year-old garden designer Itaru Sasaki. He created it as a means to talk to his cousin who had died earlier and who he missed terribly. Thousands of survivors from the 2011 Great East Japan disaster have made pilgrimages to the phone booth to talk to their loved ones who have died or gone missing. Julian had a personal and profound grief that he was trying to process in his own life. In 2022, his much-loved brother Marcus, also a writer, died suddenly aged 54. Marcus had committed suicide.
It was a huge loss, obviously, for me and our family, and a very difficult loss to deal with. So I think when we lose anyone in our lives, there's always things we wish we'd said. And when you lose someone to suicide, that's even more the case. There were things I definitely wanted to say to my brother. There was very complicated emotions. And when I stepped into the phone box, I thought I knew what I was going to say. I'd kind of rehearsed in my mind what I was going to say. But you're conscious of all the hundreds of people who've gone into that space to talk to people they lost in the disaster or people who've lost loved ones in other ways. And a friend of mine up on the coast there says the phone box is like a sincerity machine. And that's what happened. I dialed the phone number, I put the phone to my ear and I listened for a moment and then I started to speak. And what I said wasn't the words I'd rehearsed at all. It was something that came from deep inside me that really spilled out of me. And I was really surprised at what I was saying. And when I'd finished, I hung up and I stepped out of the phone box and I cried and I hugged my wife and I hugged Akiko-san and I felt just a little bit better about life. And maybe it is just easier to express what you need to say on a disconnected phone. And I think the density of all those hundreds and hundreds of people coming to that phone box, everyone's aware of how many people have come to the phone box, means that it's become a very special space. So when you step into it, you're also benefiting from everybody else telling their stories. And it's something about having a focus and knowing that it's worked for other people. So then maybe it will work for you. So I think all of those reasons mean that this phone box is an incredible piece of improvised therapy, one of the most perfect bits of improvised therapy I've ever come across.
In Julian's most recent book, 100 Tales from the Tokyo Ghost Cafe, he collaborated again with manga artist Chie Kutsuwada. Together they created a book of prose and manga inspired by their shared love of Japanese folklore. The book pays homage to the work of Lafcadio Hearn, who collected Japanese ghost stories and translated them for a Western audience in the 19th century.
Every year when I go back to Japan, I make my own pilgrimage to Lafcadio Hearn's grave and just sort of sit there and think, oh, here's someone who tried to bring culture very successfully from Japan to the West. And then when I came to write my most recent book, Tokyo Ghost Cafe, suddenly all those ghost stories started expressing themselves. I'm not really interested in the horror stories, the spooky stories. I'm more interested in how we continue to have a dialogue with people who are no longer around. And that's what ghost stories are. They're a way of thinking about what our relationship is with people who've passed away, loved ones, people we wish we could have another chance to say something to. I think after the Great East Japan disaster of 2011, there were hundreds, thousands of ghost stories that sprung up and down the coast. And I think what a lot of them were about trying to process trauma, trying to process loss. And in that storytelling, maybe we can heal ourselves a bit, because that's what really interests me. Above everything else is where we can find stories that heal us.
This year, Julian will continue with his educational work in schools. Over the last 15 years, he has visited over 400 schools, giving talks about Japanese culture and the themes reflected in his work. And he has started on his next novel with a trip to Japan planned for later this year.
So I want to continue to write about the Tohoku recovery communities. And a lot of people said to me, what I really want to emphasize is that we have hope. And as a writer and as a therapist, that's what interests me above all else, is where do we find resilience? Where do we find hope when the world looks difficult, when we're facing unimaginable problems? And I enjoy doing it now, which is quite extraordinary for a boy who's standing up in front of school would have been the biggest nightmare in his life. It's a privilege to get to share those stories with people. Let's find hope through our storytelling.